Alrighty, well, I'll get started here. Again, my name is Neal. I'm excited to talk with you guys today about some prescribed burning, a little bit of the history, why we do it, and kind of the practices that we use on the refuge. I've been in the prescribed fire program for the Fish and Wildlife Service for about 3 years now. So I'm fairly new to it, but it's been an awesome experience, and it's such a neat tool that we can use as land managers to really utilize and make the prairie a better place. So I'm going to get started with why fire. Why are we putting fire out on the landscape and burning so many acres every year? And it really, quite simply put, is that prairie would not exist without fire. Most ecologists agree that for the last 5,000 years, prairie vegetation would have diminished if it weren't for fire. So where was this fire historically coming from? Most of it was believed to be from indigenous people, and they used it much as a tool like we do today. So they used it for things like hunting, not only to drive game, but to attract game to an area because of the new growth that would come following the fire. So it would attract large herds of bison and made hunting a lot more strategical for them. It also made traveling easier. So I'm sure, as many as you know, walking through the prairie can be quite tough when you're wading through 6-foot tall blue stems. So they used it to burn large areas, and it just made traveling so much easier for them. And then lastly, safety. So of course you don't want all these fuels right next to where you're going to be setting up camp and laying your head at night. So they would a lot of times burn around their villages. That way, if there was a natural fire that came through the area, they would be protected. So that kind of goes into the other cause of the fires historically, and that was from natural causes. Typically in the summertime, during hot and dry weather, where there'd be dry lightning strikes. And those would be the kind of the main sources of ignition naturally. So throughout the Great Plains, historical fire intervals were thought to range anywhere from 1 to 35 years. And a lot of scientists believe that in the tallgrass prairie, those intervals were even smaller. So from likely 1 to 10 years. And because of this, we now end up with the prairie we have today and a lot of plants and animals that have adapted and evolved and are really dependent upon the prairie, like the bur oaks that are fire resistant and grassland birds like the Henslow sparrow that rely on the prairie to nest. So what is a prescribed burn? A prescribed fire is a controlled fire applied to the landscape under a specific set of environmental factors to achieve management goals. So what might these management goals be? They can range from varying things or multiple things. So one large one we deal with at the refuge is controlling undesirable vegetation, such as invasives or woodies. A lot of woody encroachment can be controlled by fire. And then restoring and maintaining ecological function. So the function of like the oak savanna wouldn't persist if we didn't run fire through it. And then there's a lot of science out there that states that frequent fire burning intervals can help also control plant disease and then improve plant production. So after a fire, you'll have this new lush growth of green. And a lot of these flowers will bloom and pollinate at the same time and increase seed production as well. Of course, fire is good at promoting diversity of the plants and then also provides an important food source for grazing animals. So in the bison enclosure, a lot of times we'll kind of do patch burns, rotate areas that we burn in the bison enclosure to provide them a new source of food. And on that same token, we try not to burn the whole bison enclosure at once because of course that's going to diminish all their food. And then lastly, the same kind of way that Indians use it for safety, we use it to reduce fuels and the threats from wildfire. So just reducing that fuel load on the landscape. So how much and when do we burn? So tallgrass prairie, there's no really hard and fast rule, but there are some generally accepted practices. For newly created tallgrass prairie, it's generally every year initially, the first 2 or 3 years, until a lot of those plants get established. And then once you have a nice established prairie, those burning intervals are usually every 3 to 5 years. So at Neal Smith, we try to burn at least a third of the refuge every year. That doesn't always happen, but that allows us to kind of rotate when we're burning, so animals can repopulate those burned areas subsequent to us burning them. And then the oak savanna, we try to burn every 10 to 15 years. And that's kind of dependent on how much woody encroachment we're having. So if we're having more woody encroachment, we'll try to burn that a little more frequently. So there's also a range of different times when we burn. Typically, we'll burn in the dormant seasons, which are going to be spring and fall, kind of that March, April, and then October, November timeframes. But there's also growing season burns. So if conditions exist where we've had a hot and dry kind of summer, we can put a run fire across the landscape in the summer. And this can be really beneficial to help target certain species such as woodies, because it allows that fire to persist on the cambium layer, the living growth of those trees, a little longer, and can really help knock them back. So prescribed burn planning. What is a prescribed burn plan? So that's going to be conducted under a set of site-specific and environmental conditions prepared in advance. So what is all in this plan? We're going to include things like objectives, some of our habitat goals that we might have, the types of fuels that are going to be present, where we're going to be burning. For example, are we going to be burning tallgrass prairie? Are we going to be burning our oak savanna? And then we'll also have boundaries of units that we plan on burning. So to the right there is an example of a map that we make in our plans. And that kind of delineates where we want this controlled fire to be. And then there's also the precise weather conditions that have to exist for a certain unit. So say there's a highway that's to the east of a unit we're going to burn, and we get a strong west wind. Well, of course, that's not going to be ideal conditions because we're going to be throwing smoke on the highway, and that's going to cause all kinds of safety issues. So there's this precise set of weather conditions that also has to exist. And then the individuals and entities that we have to notify, typically we'll notify Jasper County Dispatch, local fire stations, and then the local weather service to get to spot weather forecast. Another thing that we note is the location of the fire breaks. So if you've seen these large swaths of mowed areas in some of our units, those are going to be our fire breaks, and we use those to help control where we want that fire to be. And it kind of slows down on those fire breaks and allows us to stop it in its tracks. And then what kind of personnel and equipment we might need for that prescribed fire. So say we're burning just a few acres, we might need 5 or 6 people on the staff, or say we have, we're burning a couple hundred acres where we need, 15 people plus in a crew. And then also noted in there is going to be a lot of hazards. So do we have utility poles in the burn area that we need to worry about? Are there any wet areas, crossings, kind of stuff like that? So one major consideration when we're doing this is fire behavior. All firefighters in the Fish and Wildlife Service have to know exactly what is going on with the fire and what influences the fire. So fire behavior is the response of fire to physical and atmospheric conditions. And a lot of variables kind of go into play that control that behavior, such as fuel types. So like I mentioned earlier, whether we have light fuels like prairie grasses or heavy denser fuels like downed logs and timber. And then weather, of course, is a big variable. Winds play into account. Of course, higher winds are going to lead to more intense fire, a faster moving fire. Humidity, so that's one thing we pay really close attention to. Of course, the humidity in the air plays hand in hand with the moisture that's in the fuel. So if we have really low humidities, we're going to have some really intense burns. And then topography. We don't have as much topography, say, as out west, where they have mountains that really come into play, but we can use it to our advantage in some areas because we know that fire is going to run uphill and generally creep slower downhill. So these are all kind of dependent upon the fire triangle, which is shown here to the right, and all these are elements that are needed. Without one of these, we can't have fire. And with the addition of more, that's going to influence how that fire behavior acts. So fuels are going to be the main source of energy for a fire and have a lot of different varying characteristics. One of the biggest ones is size. So those larger, denser fuels, again, are going to ignite more slower, but they're going to burn longer. So they may burn all night, whereas the prairie is just going to be a very flashy burn and be less intense. The moisture content, so living plant material that's green, of course, is going to have a lot more moisture than dead and dormant plants, and drier fuels are going to burn faster and more readily, of course. Chemical composition comes into play. So plants with waxes, oils, and resins like pines and cedars are going to burn a lot more intensely than plants with low amounts like hardwoods and tall grass. And then lastly, the amount of fuels. So fuels that are densely spread across the landscape are going to burn very fast and more evenly than, say, patchy fuels like that we'd have in the bison enclosure from grazing across the landscape. So those will burn a lot slower. And then, of course, we'll get a little bit more into weather. So when weather influences all three elements that are in the fire triangle. So it's something that we really pay close attention to when doing our prescribed burn plans, and even when we're doing the prescribed burn. So temperature, of course, how that relates, a high temperature is going to decrease the amount of moisture in the fuels. So that's going to influence the fire and make it more intense, of course. Relative humidity, like I mentioned earlier, is going to affect the moisture in the plants. Wind is going to be our most difficult element to predict. Velocity and direction are kind of the most critical elements affecting fire behavior because it determines the direction of the fire and the smoke. Of course, we don't want to be throwing smoke across the road or towards a neighbor. It's going to increase that oxygen supply, one of the elements of the fire triangle. It's going to increase moisture loss in fuels, increase the speed of the fire, and it also can preheat vegetation in front of the fire, which allows it to dry even faster. And then precipitation, that one's pretty obvious. Of course, if it's raining, we're probably not going to be burning, and that's going to affect fuel moisture. And then if we have a lot of large rain events in the spring, that's going to lead to greening of the vegetation and kind of slow down our activity. And then atmospheric stability is the last one. So a stable atmosphere usually resists the upward movement of air, which causes unpredictable fire behavior. And we typically measure that using the Haynes index, which indicates the dryness and stability of the air. And that's on a scale of 2 to 6. So a Haynes index of 2 is going to be a pretty stable atmosphere, whereas a Haynes index of 6 is going to be very unstable and lend a hand to intense fire behavior. So to kind of sum that up, some elements that are going to go into a low intensity fire, little slope. If there's little slope on the ground, you're going to have a low intense fire. North facing slopes, your fuels are small, fuels are living. So if you have green fuels, they're light and patchy, moisture is high, and light winds are all going to lend a hand to low intensity burns. High intensity, those are going to typically consist of areas with lots of slope, south facing slopes that will dry faster, where we have large fuels that are dead and dormant are going to be very intense. The fuel loads are heavy and continuous across the landscape, moisture is low, and heavy winds. So here's kind of a depiction of how those are all influenced. To the left there, we see a south-facing slope that's going to have light fuels and it's going to be dried by the sun. So of course, we expect that to have very intense fire behavior when compared to the north side of the slope, which is going to have very heavy fuels. And then to the right there, we can kind of see the influence of the slope and the airflow going up the hill and how it can preheat vegetation. So pre-burn preparations, these are kind of the things we do before we even get out there the day of putting fire on the ground. Things we need to consider are constructing those fire breaks and getting fire breaks around protection items like infrastructure. If we burn around the visitor center, we need to make sure that area is protected. or any other structures that might be out there that we want to keep. So fire breaks can be like remote areas that you see a lot on the refuge, but they can also be natural areas like rivers and lakes, ponds, and a lot of times we use roads. A lot of our units are bisected by roads on the refuge, so they work as great fire breaks. Some of the things we consider when prepping equipment, we need to get our fire engine ready. So we have a large fire engine with a tank and a large pump on the back. We have ATV units that have pumps, and they're a little more mobile that allow us to get out into the units and attack fire. Water tenders, hand tools. We have a variety of hand tools we use from rakes and shovels to help us to kind of control the fire on the fire line. And then drip torches. If you're not familiar with a drip torch, it's basically a canister with a large wick on the end that holds a mixture of gasoline and diesel. And we use those as kind of a way to ignite the fire. And then of course we need to make sure our radios are charged up, ready to go, because clear, concise communication is key to having effective operations on fire. Kestrels, which are kind of weather predicting instruments. And then Nomex clothing. So if you've seen the yellow shirts and the green pants that we wear, those are fire resistant clothing that we're required to wear and offers protection against burns. So the day of burning operations, we typically like to all get together and we'll get a brief. We'll get the crew, and the burn boss is gonna allocate, you know, whose duties are going to be what. We have road crew positions, we have smoke spotters, people that are controlling traffic, people that are going to be controlling and patrolling the fire lines, igniters. So we'll kind of figure out who's going to do what task and lay that all out. We're going to go over the conditions, weather conditions that we have that day, and kind of the fire behavior we expect. We're going to go over the objectives, kind of what our habitat goals are with this burn, and then the smoke management. Again, we don't want to be throwing smoke across the road, or if we have a neighbor that's close by and the wind switch, we don't want to be putting neighbors or smoke on top of neighbors. And then last thing we'll do is kind of go over a contingency plan. So that's kind of like the oh crap, if a fire jumps a line and gets into another unit, are we going to attack that fire direct and put water on it, or do we need to get out ahead of that fire and burn out another area to kind of stop it and prevent it from traveling further? So once that's good, we're pretty much ready to put fire on the ground. And typically how that works is we'll get on the downwind side of the unit and slowly light a backing fire into the unit to create a large buffer of black on the downwind side. That way we can prevent fire from traveling and crossing fire breaks. And then once we have a good amount of black, we'll go upwind and carry the fire down from there. So after the firing operations are done, we'll typically do what we call a mop up, and we'll go out and patrol the lines, check to make sure there's no smoke on the fire breaks. If there's any large timber or burning embers, we need to make sure those are put out and put to bed before we go home at night. And then lastly, we'll go over an AAR, which is an after action review, and kind of just discuss with everyone what was the plan, what did we accomplish, and did it all go as planned, and kind of what we can do better and what we can work on. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions if y'all have any.
Hey, Neal, excellent presentation. That was just awesome. Thank you so much. So we did have a question in the chat, and the question was, how about the animals and insects that are living in where you're going to be doing that prescribed fire? You know, do many of them perish, get injured, or do they take refuge, or what's your thoughts on, you know, how do the wildlife manage with this application of fire?
Sure, that's a great question. So a lot of times with like mammals and things, those can outrun the fire. Of course, birds can um, fly away, but a lot of our animals there are going to be displaced. Really the biggest concern, I think, is going to be our insects. That's the things that are going to be hit the hardest. But that's kind of why we try to do patchy burns and burn a third of the refuge at a time. That allows those unburned areas to hold those populations. And when those burn areas, green up and start a new prairie, then we can repopulate those areas.
And then, a lot of the animals have burrows underground that they can, because the
So
fire goes pretty
reptiles and
quickly.
things like that, they're going to find those wet, kind of damp areas and get out of the way of the fire. Things like grassland birds, it's inevitable. We're going to probably burn over a few nests in the spring. They're typically pretty resilient. Grassland birds they'll have multiple broods a year, so that they're no problem that they can make a new nest, and they're typically pretty resilient with that.
And the benefit outweighs the things that the negative impacts, because if we don't burn the prairie, then we don't have prairie and we don't have that wildlife in the
Yep.
ecosystem. So and then there's another question from Jim Johnson, and the question is, what training do observers or volunteers that help with the traffic control need to do to help with the prescribed fire?
So if anyone's interested, just reach out to me or Scott, the refuge manager, and it's pretty informal training. We'll just kind of go over with what we expect and kind of the safety protocol and how to communicate on the radio properly. And really it's something anyone can do. So if anyone is interested, we're always looking for people to do kind of road guards and traffic control while we're conducting burns.
And Neal, if you would touch base, it's a pretty arduous physical taking on to become a wildland firefighter for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Would you describe the training and the physical and what's needed? And that's why we don't really allow volunteers, because there's so much cost and time that's put into training and getting somebody up to speed with that.
Right. There's a full gamut of different training modules that we have to go through, and courses and certifications that we have to have. And then there's actually a pretty intense physical that we have to go through. We have to get medical clearance, and we do what we call a pack test. So we'll put on a weighted vest and have to basically walk/run for 3 miles under 45 minutes. Doesn't sound like much, but after the end of the second mile, you're pretty dog tired of calves are burning. So yeah, there's a lot of different tests you have to go through, and safety training, and there's really a lot of loops you have to jump through before you can get out on your first fire.
Yeah, thanks for stating that, Neal. Yeah, and the good part of that is that it's for the person's safety, so that they're well suited for doing that arduous work, which is very difficult work. I was just out taking photos and just the smoke and the soot, and and I'm not I'm just away from the fire, but just getting that residual smoke, and it was long lasting on me for the rest of the day. So it's not easy work, and it takes a lot of dedicated fire crew to really do a hard job. But I think most of them really are passionate and realize how important that job is. So we appreciate Neal's work. It's not easy work, and it's very beneficial. So thank you, Neal.